Welcome to the fortnightly roundup of news and polls from Ipsos MORI. And this month, good news. Our economic optimism has surged to heights that we haven't seen for some years. And in fact, it's been the steepest climb in optimism that we've ever seen at Ipsos MORI in work going back to 1978. It's worth saying that there was a massive surge in 2009 and the economy didn't necessarily boom in quite the same way, and some of it may be just this pent-up expectation of improvement after the pandemic. But nevertheless, it's good news. People are feeling better. Perhaps because people are feeling more secure, we've seen a general decline, particularly among people who've been vaccinated, the 55 to 75s, in terms of how much people are following the rules all the time. And they've gone down from 6 out of 10 to 4 out of 10, a steeper decline than younger groups, perhaps reflecting the fact that they're feeling a bit safer. Overall, most people say they're comfortable meeting people outside the household, shopping in supermarkets, going to their GP, etc. And really, the only things where there's perhaps substantial concern is getting people inside the home and staying overnight with friends and family, which of course is still currently banned. So perhaps it's not surprising. But overall, people look as though they're going to spring back into some sort of normal way of life, although our detailed projects for people like Nationwide on how often people will go back into offices does suggest that a permanent change, because of the busting of the taboo against remote working, may be happening. In terms of how the government's doing, they have the highest ratings now since October, and they're obviously helped by the successful rollout of the pandemic. 97% of Conservative voters and 85% of Labour voters say that the government is doing a good job in terms of disseminating the vaccine. They're a bit more mixed, as this chart shows, in terms of their views of the overall handling of the pandemic. But it's interesting to see the criticism of the government in Scotland, where, of course, the SNP levels of support are at pretty much record levels, but also, interestingly, in Northern Ireland, where the leader of the DUP, Arlene Foster, has just been deposed. But overall, the government's ratings on the pandemic have improved during 2021. And in fact, we've got to the point that 63% of us now say that we support sending spare vaccines off to India. There's only 15% opposed to that. And indeed, 36% say, given what's going on in India, we should send them anyway, even if it means delaying vaccination in Britain. And with the news of thousands and thousands of deaths on a daily basis, you can sort of understand why we are sympathetic. So no man is an island and no country is an island. And Britain is willing to help other countries with the vaccine and with the pandemic. In terms of politics, we've seen a drop in support for the Conservative Party. It's down 5 points to 40%. Labour hasn't been the beneficiary of this. It may just simply be that all of the noises about sleaze, the Dominic Cummings row, the Curtains row, all the other rows are potentially starting to affect Conservative support, but we'll see how that goes. Overall, as many people are satisfied with Boris Johnson, in fact, more people are satisfied with Boris Johnson than Keir Starmer, although more people are dissatisfied. He remains a polarising figure. And indeed, perhaps one of the reasons the Labour Party isn't making more hay of some of the challenges the government's currently imposing on itself is that overall satisfaction with Keir Starmer has been falling steadily over the last year. And on a like-for-like, who would you prefer as Prime Minister? Despite all of his problems of his curtains and everything else, many more people would still choose Boris Johnson than Keir Starmer. We've also looked at trust in MPs generally, something that we've been doing regularly since the 1980s. And it's just a reminder, trust in MPs is pretty much low, as it generally is, at fewer than 1 in 4. But interestingly, around half of us say that we trust our local MP. And that's sometimes a reminder when we talk about people hating all politicians. Actually, local MPs are trusted, where people have that, much more likely to have that connection. In terms of prime ministers and the leader of the opposition, and which ones are seen as most trustworthy, two relatively perceived as unsuccessful premiers, Theresa May and John Major, are seen as most trustworthy. And indeed, Keir Starmer, who's behind in the polls, is more trustworthy than the Prime Minister. But Mr Cameron, with his dealings with Greensill Capital, is by far the sleaziest or least trusted, up there with Tony Blair, who's got all sorts of history hanging over him. But it's interesting that Keir Starmer is seen as more trustworthy than Boris Johnson, but is behind in the polls. And that was precisely what we saw in the 1980s, when Mr Kinnock consistently beat Mrs Thatcher in terms of being more honest and consistently lost general elections. Nevertheless, Theresa May, John Major, trustworthy, David Cameron, not. And that's it. Lots of elections coming up next week, particularly those in Scotland we'll be looking at in great detail. Got a webinar with my colleagues Emily and Rachel in Edinburgh. There'll be updates there in terms of how that's going. Real potential to upset the apple cart that is the UK with support for independence in Scotland at pretty high levels. So watch out for that. Elsewhere, we've looked at attitudes to climate change. 7 out of 10 people say Britons say the government will fail us if it doesn't do something about climate change. But it also shows that our understanding of it is pretty mixed. Lots of us think that recycling will probably save the planet, when in fact, not driving a car or not having any children would make a much bigger difference. That's all for this week. Do dig into our website if you want more. Thank you very much.